Welcome back to the Altman Symposium for 2018, Urban Futures. Thanks to those of you who came last night, and thanks for coming this morning to hear the Joffrian Student Fellows present the research that they have been working on throughout this year. I'm pleased to introduce all of them together. I'm going to introduce them as a panel, and then they're just going to each get up and give their talk with no further introduction. So I'm going to introduce them in the order of the presentations they're going to make. The first will be Jacob Brueggemann, who is presenting a paper called Becoming Homeless: How We've Talked About People We Don't Want to See. Abby Culpepper will be presenting Toward an Eco-Poetics of Urban Dwelling. Samuel Hunter is presenting Heaven is a Place in New York City: Queer Urbanity and the Resistance of a Heterosexist Public. Phoebe Myers will present a talk called Smitty's Men and Boys Wear: Reflections on Progress in Over the Rhine. And Rachel Wydra will present Ticas Take Charge: Urban Dynamics of Costa Rican Women's Activism. We're very proud of these students and the work that they've done this year. Please join me in giving them a round of applause. Jacob?
All right, so I have the high honor of starting us off today, and so I'll try to wake everybody up and keep it lively, if you will. So let's begin. So if we are here today to productively discuss our urban futures, we must first discuss our urban pasts and the histories we've written of them. Often untold in the public square, the histories and lives of hyper-marginalized groups, the homeless being one of them, need telling. Today I'll outline a general history of the language and labels American communities have used to make sense of homelessness as a condition often created in dense metropolitan communities to make sense of and control the poorest of the poor, the economically and physically destitute underclass we broadly call the homeless. For the past year, I've analyzed homelessness in Cincinnati during the late 20th century as a microcosm of a national phenomenon in which our city saw the emergence of a new homelessness, a characteristic of which were rapidly increasing numbers of unhoused people populating the streets of America's largest urban centers in the late 1970s and early 1980s. In this era, the public witnessed the homeless gather in encampments, parks, street corners in almost all of America's cities, and as such came to understand the homeless as an obstacle to normal citizens' routines, neoliberal city administrations, and, in a general sense, society. My research on Cincinnati thus calls us towards period and city-specific histories, many of which you may be able to talk about from personal memory. However, I do not discuss the history of Cincinnati and its homeless population in a vacuum. My Cincinnati-specific inquiry is one prong in a broader, historically based, linguistic critique of the ways in which we, by which I mean the societal we, discuss the homeless. My presentation's title, Becoming Homeless: How We've Talked About People We Don't Want to See, thus gets at a broader history, through which Americans, again, particularly those in urban environments, have developed a value-laden vocabulary used to contextualize extreme urban poverty by ascribing to the homeless a cultural condition of which poverty is the symptom. By the urban, I should say that I mean Americans' metropolitan regions, our cityscapes and their crisscrossing alleys and concealed corners. This is not to say that the homeless do not populate suburban or rural areas. Rather, it is to recognize that our cities are the crucibles in which the cultural condition of homelessness to which I'm referring was created and is continuing to be created. This condition precedes, shapes, accompanies, and yet survives the homeless. And I have to mention, though, the homeless alter it by conversing with the public through activism and protests, through defying the condition by being other than that which it was intended to describe, namely an undeserving, unhealthy, and nearly subhuman class of failures, societal rejects left to rot under the rafters. That's part of this cultural condition, right? Of all the reading and research I've done for this project, actually one of the best statements that encapsulates that condition comes from Octavia Butler's The Parable of the Sower. Here it is. Most of the street poor, squatters, winos, junkies, homeless people in general, are dangerous. They're desperate or crazy or both. That's enough to make anyone dangerous. That's the quote. So returning to the urban, if homelessness is perceived by the public as a cultural condition, and this perception takes place in predominantly urban publics, it is thus urban centers' public policies that have produced and continue to project this perception. Such an understanding is not the simply defined socioeconomic condition of being without a home, but again, a broader condition that throughout our history was made and remade to convey characteristics, meanings, and values, alcoholism and criminality come to mind, that stigmatize the homeless, that legitimates, and that therefore legitimates their impoverishment as a result of personal or even moral failings. That's the work that this cultural condition does. In the United States, then, the condition of being without a home is different than that of being perceived as homeless. In a broader historical sense, the condition of homelessness to which I refer includes the myriad groups that, for different reasons in different places and times, did not occupy a place permanently. The distinction between the cultural and the economic is essential for understanding what homelessness means in America. The former being the brutal realities of being homeless, the latter being the complex, community-specific, and ever-evolving meanings of being homeless in America. The meanings of homelessness as a cultural condition in the United States can be traced through the labels used to identify other groups that we would broadly call the homeless today in American history. Burly bums, bummers, far wanderers, hobos, itinerant laborers, jokers, ne'er-do-wells, tinkers, tramps, vagabonds, vagrants, weary willies, the working poor, and other group labels that have come in and out of popular use today are condensed into the homeless, and they carry with them values that were associated with those labels. The values associated with those labels, again, today coalescing in a catch-all homelessness, drape the homeless in a stigmatized set of costumes and stage props. Again, one that stage props and costumes, if you will, that provide the public with a narrative, a condition through which the homeless and their situations are contextualized, rationalized in the city. And I should note there that I'm drawing on, much to my history advisor's chagrin, Foucault, Goffman, and James Scott, and a lot of other theorists. It's not as much primary sources. It's been a struggle in this project. We're coming from a historical angle, this dalliance with theory that I'm having. So let me continue here. So let's take, for example, the language of Henry Cisneros, a Secretary of Housing and Urban Development in the late 1990s, serving under Bill Clinton, who in a December 1996 publication of HUD said the following, and I'll skip around to save some time here. Homeless people tend to be the sickest, most ragged, and the most difficult people for society to accept. The least able to help themselves, sliding deeply more into danger. Many use substances as a method of self-medication. The greatest threat aside from society as a whole, the greatest threat many mentally ill homeless people pose is to themselves. So again, what we're seeing in that quote is the value Cisneros is ascribing to the homeless coming from centuries-long build-up of these conditions that previously were used to describe the vagrant, the tramp, or the hobo, three labels that in my project I analyzed in 19th and 20th century urban America. And I use that analysis to better understand how homeless people occupied and moved within Cincinnati's public spaces, and how those same publics attempted to police them because of a condition from which they supposedly suffered. So thus, while the homeless endure economic and physical conditions of being without permanent places to call home, they must also tolerate the assumptions and stigmas that both society at large and specific communities ascribe to being homeless in America. I think I'm doing okay on time, so I'll give a little anecdote here. Early on in this project, I did some informal ethnographic work in just Cincinnati, and I went over there one day, and I was like trying to talk to people, and it was like 11 a.m., and I had bought a pack of American Spirits, and we were smoking out on this bench. I was smoking with this homeless guy, Carter, and one of the things that he said that will stick with me forever is, I haven't been me since I started on the streets. And I think that we can read that as the mental weight of this condition that I'm talking about. We could talk more about that later, too. I of course, have to skip around a little bit because time restrictions. So let me close on that note. As we look forward to the 21st century, a century that will be undoubtedly dominated by the urban, studying and understanding the history of homelessness as a cultural condition will be crucial. Such research has the potential to inform new, innovative public policy that attempts to house the homeless and help today's truly needy in our urban metropolises Indeed, in a world with global itinerant labor forces and massive flows of individuals, immigrants, and refugees passing through national, state, and local, as well as rural-urban boundaries, although Neil Brenner he was here earlier, he probably disagreed with that distinction, that would help us to better understand the societal processes that assign meaning to marginalized and hyper-marginalized groups, and thus it will be essential for our project of creating better, more just urban futures in the United States. So with that, thank you very much, and look forward to Q&A.
So while my PowerPoint is loading, I just want to take a moment to thank everyone who showed up at this wonderful early panel today. It's always nice to be able to have people listen to our work. I want to give a special thanks to the staff of the Humanities Center, of which I'm a part of. It's so exciting to be able to participate in this program. Thank you to Dr. Melly and Steve and Polly for this, and thank you to the other Geoffreyan Fellows who have made this program so exciting and rich. With that, I'd like to turn towards my work toward an eco-poetics of urban dwelling. About the way I go? Oh. In The Three Ecologies, Felix Guattari highlights the nature of our current eco-political climate, stating, quote, "Now, more than ever, nature cannot be separated from culture. In order to comprehend the interactions between ecosystems, the mechanosphere, and the social and individual universes of reference, we must learn to think transversely," end quote. Living within an increasingly urban world, which this year's Altman program has explored in depth, the need to think transversely is greater than ever. We have now entered a period some theorists are calling the Anthropocene, characterized by human dominance of biological, chemical, and geological processes on Earth, evident in environmental issues such as deforestation, mass glaciation, and anthropogenic climate change. As Paul Crutzen and Christian Svegler elaborate, quote, "A long-held religious and philosophical idea, humans as the masters of Earth, has turned into stark reality," end quote. Yet this so-called reality isn't what it appears to be. It's premised on a dualism between humanity and nature, which privileges the human subject, and by extension, civilization, over and against that which is other, nature. However, this dualism is itself false, merely a continuation of the anthropocentric logic premised on a false belief of human exceptionalism. Humans are never separate from the world, but rather, as Kevin DeLuca explains, quote, "Humanity is always in the world, a part of the world, and indeed is constituted by relations in the world," end quote. That is to say that we have an ontological relationship to our surroundings, our environment, one which we are currently neglecting. Thus, when we arrive at the paradox of the Anthropocene. It is only when we think we are masters of nature, the exception to our biosphere, that we realize we aren't. The biological, ecological, and geological systems which have been put into motion are not ones we can control, nor can we detach ourselves from them. Thus, as we struggle to remove CO2 from the atmosphere and frantically try covering glaciers with tarps to prevent further melting, we ironically come face to face with our powerlessness, trapped in an environmental catastrophe from which we are not isolated. Yet, these aforementioned environmental problems may seem distant to the majority of the human population, whose environments are not filled with redwoods and glaciers, but rather skyscrapers and concrete. To this end, I return to the idea of thinking transversely. The historic divide between the urban and the natural is artificial. We are not and cannot think of ourselves as distanced from our environment. In fact, etymologically, the word environment merely refers to that which surrounds us, not solely something which we consider natural. As such, I'd like to propose the concept of ecopoetics, understood through a Heideggerian lens as a way of thinking transversely, a way of being in the world, and as an approach which lends itself to a form of dwelling, one which can empower the urban subject to recognize their relationship to being which surrounds them. However, before I elaborate on this approach, I'd like to first outline the current relationship established by technological processes between human being, Heidegger's Dasein, and other beings, so as to pinpoint how ecopoetics might restructure such relationships. First is the idea that the environment is a manageable resource. This mindset is dangerous as best as it relies upon the validity of scientific understanding of the environment while ignoring the historical context of these scientific practices, which themselves have developed out of desire for management and control. Secondly, the technological framing of the environment reduces its essence to standing reserve, perpetually at our disposal, justifying a never-ending cycle of environmental exploitation and industrial production, which is already unsustainable. Thus, without a radical shift in this mindset, environmental destruction will only continue. And so we return to the idea of eco-poetics as a way not to think about the environment, but rather as a way to think transversally, to resituate ourselves in relation to our environments. But what exactly is eco-poetics? Eco-poetics seeks to combine ecology and poetry in recognition of the interconnectedness of being. As Pierre Songe explains, quote, in its etymology, eco-poetics harks back firstly to the Greek poiein, to a literary making that any poetic examines. The word also shares a root with ecology, coming from okos, which describes the house in a way that includes not only family members, but also the home and the earth. If for the sciences, ecology is the study of interactions between organisms and the environment, for the general public, the term refers to an attitude which takes into account the interconnection of all living things, and is conscientious of how we inhabit the earth, end quote. Thus, eco-poetics is concerned with the relationship between poetic creation and our natural surroundings, both physical and social. However, this raises yet another question. Why poetry? In responding to this question, I'd like to turn more explicitly to the work of German philosopher Martin Heidegger, whose essay, The Question Concerning Technology, traces the way in which technology reduces the essence of being to a standing reserve, in contrast to poetic creation, poesis, or the bringing forth of essence. It is from this connection between poetry and the arising of something out of itself, also described as presencing, that poetry offers a possibility of disrupting the technological mindset. Heidegger also outlines a relationship between poetic creation and dwelling. Quote, poetry, first of all, admits man's dwelling into its very nature, its presencing being. Poetry is the original admission of dwelling. But through what do we attain to a dwelling place? Through building. Poetic creation, which lets us dwell, is a kind of building. If we search out the nature of poetry according to this viewpoint, then we arrive at the nature of dwelling. However, Heidegger is careful to distinguish between dwelling and inhabiting, noting that dwelling goes beyond simply occupying a space. Rather, he explains that this building, seen in the quote above, which is derived from the German verb bauen, to build, is etymologically related to the German verb to be, sein. From this, he draws a connection between being and dwelling. However, this raises yet another question. How does dwelling relate to eco-poetics? Dwelling is related to eco-poetics, as dwelling is always necessarily dwelling on Earth, and as such is a way of recognizing the interconnectedness of terrestrial beings highlighted by an eco-poetic approach. Moreover, Heidegger argues that this dwelling has the potential to preserve or recognize the essence of terrestrial being. Quote, humans dwell in that they save the earth. Saving does not only snatch something from danger. To save properly means to set something free into its own essence. To save the earth is more than to exploit it or even to wear it out. Saving the earth does not master the earth, nor does it subjugate it, which is merely one step from boundless spoliation. Rather, dwelling itself is always a staying with things. End quote. It is this staying with things that I find most helpful in understanding the mechanism of dwelling. In this way, dwelling truly offers the ability to resist the managerial grip of technology over the environment. Now that we've worked through the potential of eco-poetics and dwelling as a response to environmental degradation, I'd like to take some time to briefly think through the possibilities for this model in the context of the urban, and more specifically, what one might consider urban poetry. Take, for example, the poem The Swan by 19th century French poet Charles Baudelaire. The poem is a meditation on the transformation of Paris, as the poet describes the replacement of a bohemian artist's district, le Quartier de la Doyenne, with a carousel, an exchange which modern urban theorists would undoubtedly label as gentrification. However, we can also imagine this poem as a way of preserving a connection to a changing environment, a way of retaining the essence of a space that no longer resembles its past forms. To reframe this in a more current context, the poem can be seen as a way to function to not only grapple with the redevelopment of a city, a topic which has arisen frequently over the course of this year's program, but also a way to resist this geographic erasure, to stay in place. Now, even if you're not familiar with the poetry of Charles Baudelaire or the geography of Paris, I'm sure you're familiar with the structure that currently stands on what used to be the Quartier du Doyen. Thus, perhaps when attempting to grapple with our own urban futures, we can begin by approaching our own urban environments eco-poetically, to take time to dwell within and amongst the plenitude of being we are constantly in proximity to, and little by little we may begin to resist the tide of environmental exploitation and hyper-industrialization. Perhaps also this dwelling will allow us to not only prepare for our urban futures, but to remember our urban pasts and explore the ways in which the two are intimately related. Thank you.
All right, well, now I get to go third. So while my PowerPoint's getting set up, I just want to also thank everyone for coming out tonight. I also like to thank my faculty advisor, Dr. Stephanie Dunning, for all of her help on this. Our fantastic faculty fellows in the Altman program, Kathy and Iñaki, for all of your help. Everyone at the Humanities Center for letting me participate in this program and helping out in every way, and also to my fellow G Fellows for all of our late night group me messages. All right, so my paper is titled Queer Urbanity and Resistance of a Heterosexist Public. Since the Stonewall riots in 1969, there has been a close relationship between the queer subject and urban place. In the minds of many queers and non-queers alike, the city is where we belong, and for queers to leave the city is to risk bodily harm. Jack Halberstam terms this association metronormativity, meaning the conflation of urban and visible and many normalizing narratives of gay and lesbian subjectivities. Many queers see the urban as the only location where they can visibly exist. Queers born in non-urban spaces are forced to make migration a part of coming out. Queerness cannot survive outside of the city, and the city must have at least a few queers. This narrative has been repeatedly critiqued, and for good reason. Queer existence outside of the urban is indeed possible without necessarily inviting violent reprisal. So rather than add to these critiques, I'm instead interested in the enduring value of the urban to queers. After all, even in his book criticizing metronormativity, Halberstam, who lives in Los Angeles, admits that he is one of those people for whom lonely rural landscapes feel laden with menace. If numerous projects have endeavored to defend rural queer existence, why does the bond between queer people and the urban endure? I argue that the current urban system routinely ruptures normative time and space, allowing queer counterpublics to survive heterosexist pressures as just one type of space among many. Michel Desserteaux describes New York City as a city composed of paroxysmal places in monumental relief. The spectator can read it in a universe that is constantly exploding. If the city is indeed constantly exploding with peoples and structures, queer attraction to the urban is an attraction to the proliferation of spaces. Within these urban spaces, queer subjects can survive the pressures of a heterosexist public. While projects aiming to expand queer access to public space remain vital for the urban futures of queer survival, queer communities were first formed on the margins of society. Examining the spatial constructions of these margins shows how the urban became a site of queer enchantment. A prominent fictional example can be found in James Baldwin's novel Giovanni's Room. Set in post-war Paris, the novel traces the relationship between David, an American expat, and Giovanni, an Italian immigrant who works in a gay bar. It's at the gay bar, a uniquely urban phenomenon, where they meet, and it's in Giovanni's titular room where their relationship truly unfolds. Both the gay bar, described by Baldwin as a noisy, crowded, ill-lit sort of tunnel of dubious reputation, and the room that Robert Reed Farr calls squalid, overcrowded, and never quite finished, allow for queer intimacies to occur inside of the pressures of heterosexist culture. As a semi-public location, the gay bar allows for the circulation of individuals, bringing queers from across the city into contact with one another. Once David and Giovanni meet in this space, they then turn to Giovanni's room as a haven from heterosexuality to experience their queer desires. David narrates, I remember that life in that room seemed to be occurring beneath the sea. Time flowed past indifferently above us. Hours and days had no meaning. Although the novel's tragic conclusion shows how the pressures of heterosexist society can ultimately destroy the queer subject, the earlier parts of the novel show how, at least for a time, queer relationships can be forged in counterpublic spaces made possible by the urban. Another real-world example of the formation of queer counterpublics can be found in Samuel R. Delaney's Times Square Red, Times Square Blue. Drawing on his personal experience, Delaney relays numerous anecdotes from the porn theater community that proliferated in New York City for decades. Most of his stories are sexual in nature, detailing both his encounters and those that he witnessed. But all of his stories are connected by the concept of contact, as defined by urban theorist Jane Jacobs. In Contact, an urban phenomenon of unplanned encounters across socioeconomic divides, Delaney frames stories of buying sandwiches for homeless hustlers, or hookups between otherwise closeted blue-collar workers, as allowing for the constitution of a community under the nose of a hostile public. It would have been impossible for such a community to exist outside of urban density. One of Delaney's stories concerns his relationship with Jonathan, a young man who claims to be 20 the first time they meet in a porn theater. Running into Jonathan on the sidewalk years later, Jonathan confesses that he was, in fact, only 15 at the time of their first hookup, but describes his time in the theater in glowing terms. It was fucking wonderful. Everybody was so nice. I mean, I was just a kid. The guys in here could have chewed me up and spit me out back then, but they didn't. I remember one guy in here one evening who had an extra ticket to a Broadway show. My first Broadway play. I was maybe 17. A week later, he got us some tickets to a concert up at Lincoln Center. You told me all about applying to Manhattan Community College, how I didn't have to be scared of all the classes. I didn't know any of that shit. In a queer counterpublic, Jonathan was able to locate resources through contact that would be barred to him by compulsory heterosexuality. He gained not just sexual pleasure, but relationships and knowledge that led to tangible benefits. None of this would be possible without the urban environment that allowed for the porn theaters that in turn sustained a vibrant queer counterpublic. Much has changed since the heyday of New York City's porn theaters. As Delaney goes on to detail, the porn theaters were shuttered by various New York City mayoral administrations in the name of cleaning up the city for development and financialization. By removing the physical space in which queer counterpublics could develop, heterosexist power reasserted its ability to privilege heterosexuality and normativity, forcing queers to develop different infrastructures less susceptible to heterosexist power. The internet and the popularization of smartphones has proved invaluable in the constructions of new queer counterpublics. Apps like Grindr have taken the place of David and Giovanni's chance meeting in a gay bar, linking two or more parties interested in expressing queer desires. Missing, though, is the true sense of community and contact, rather than simply interaction between two individuals. Delaney's stories of a time long past, or Baldwin's tragic romance, offer visions of queer urbanity where contact and sexuality intermingle in a shared space, allowing for non-normative connections to be made. The immense potential for queer counterpublic production, found only in the urban, continues to have great relevance as heterosexist pressure continues to squeeze into queer spaces. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. I wanted to thank all of you again for coming out. I know it's bright and early. And I also want to thank everyone who made this program possible. I have absolutely enjoyed participating and doing my research, and I'm super excited to be able to talk to you guys today about what I've been focusing on for like this past school year. And we're talking about Smitty's Men's and Boys Wear. Smitty's Men's and Boys Wear is a local business in Over the Rhine that began selling men's clothing over 90 years ago. A few decades into its existence is when the current owner, Larry Ashford, began to work as a clerk at the age of 16. He never left, and I had the pleasure of talking with him during my quest to uncover what makes small businesses like Smitty's able to persevere and be successful through the decades. And perhaps, even more importantly, why they're so often ignored in narratives of what urban progress looks like. Over the Rhine has made headlines very frequently as a neighborhood overall. Perhaps the instigator of those headlines were the so-called Cincinnati riots of 2001. These riots were sparked after the shooting of unarmed black teenager Timothy Thomas, who was killed by police during an attempted arrest for nonviolent misdemeanors. Since that time, Over the Rhine has topped lists claiming it to be the most dangerous neighborhood in the nation, as well as having the highest income inequality. In recent years, however, this narrative has dramatically shifted. In 2015, the Cincinnati Enquirer published this article titled "How the Miracle on Vine Street Evolved." And Vine Street is like the main street where a lot of development has occurred in Over the Rhine. This article really details the development that has characterized Over the Rhine since around 2003. 2003 was the year that 3CDC, or Cincinnati Center City Development Corporation, was debuted. This corporation is a private public entity, and it's so far completed 58 projects in Cincinnati and essentially completely replaced the city planning department that was abolished in 2002, and it was reinstated in 2008. But for 5 years, 3CDC was really making the decisions about what inner Cincinnati was going to look like. This development really coincides with the shift in narrative about how OTR is viewed. And in this article, former 3CDC consultant Kathleen Norris outlined how difficult it was to get investors initially willing to enter OTR due to its reputation. And you can see in this quote here, she speaks about crime, but also insinuates that whatever problems she may have faced have now been eradicated due to the question of how much money is in the ground, how much money has been invested. The comparison of this development to a miracle aligns itself with the Renaissance narrative being used to describe the changes in Over the Rhine. Thomas Dutton, architect and longtime OTR activist, outlined the problematic Renaissance comparison and spoke of a dark age before development in which spaces like Smitty's don't exist. This narrative of a miracle or rebirth implies something was built from nothing. Smitty's could not have lasted for over 90 years for nothing. They were serving a community that existed through the Dark Ages and has largely been ignored. The study of spaces like Smitty's not only gives credit to the efforts of residents who have been systematically overlooked, but also provides insight on how to model development in a truly community-serving fashion during times of increased issues with gentrification as well as privatization. Uncovering what allows small businesses to survive the Renaissance is key to imagining a future urbanity that is inclusive from the ground up. But why is Smitty's and Dark Age businesses like it so ignored as a business success story? About half an hour into my interview with Larry, he asked me if I had seen the kids yet. When I had first gone in, I had noticed a playpen in the back room, and when I went to go say hi, I found two kids. One was a baby, one was maybe around 3. And I found out that those were not Larry's relatives. Rather, they just watch the kids while their mother goes to work at the Cincinnati Zoo in the janitorial services. How do developers operating in a traditional economic model of exponential profit take into account aspects like community childcare? In addition to watching those 2 children, Larry told me if I had come a few hours later, I would find about 6 to 8 kids in the back room that they kind of just watch when they get home from school until their parents are able to come pick them up after work. Smitty's is also inhabited by a small dog named Ebony, and during my interview, a man from the neighborhood, Doug, came in to take Ebony for a walk, and this was apparently pretty much a weekly occurrence. And Larry also informed me that residents will bring her gifts, dog toys, treats, things like that. And in that same line of thinking, and traditional business models it is impossible to really quantify the effects that this stress relief of having access to a pet may have on local residents who might not have the time or the means to have a pet of their own. Smitty's operates almost as a public space in that a purchase is not automatically required to utilize their heating system to pet Ebony or to just sit and shoot the shit with Larry or other employees. In that manner, it is really a community cornerstone. But regardless, even their profit-driven, what they sell, is still outside the norm of the types of businesses that are now populating over the Rhine. Smitty's caters to a black male audience and specializes in offering sizes that are larger than what is available in straight-size stores. So already, even what they're selling is serving an overlooked demographic of the market, which is actually an extension of the local population and their needs. Are these characteristics of Smitty's potentially threatening to developers operating within a traditional economic model, or is it just falling out of favor, like answering the needs of the local population in favor of people who might be able to afford a $10 hot dog at the Senate restaurant, one of the newly developed enterprises there? It's difficult to just to discern the exact cause, but the results are clear. Although it has stood in Over the Rhine for almost 100 years, recently Smitty's has had to relocate twice, still within Over the Rhine, but being pushed to the outskirts. The first time was after a fire of unknown beginnings blazed through its storefront. After this fire, 3CDC bought the building and buildings next to it, and it's currently part of a $19 million project that you can see on the left side of the screen to combine 5 buildings and a few vacant lots into a single 5-story building with 45,000 square feet of office space. If Smitty's, a white-owned capitalistic enterprise, is facing risk of relocation, it's difficult to imagine the possible fate of individual residents or families who are not producing in that capitalistic sense. Is there room for them in the new Over the Rhine? 3CDC lists the following 4 goals for their development on their website. And as you can see, it focuses a lot on civic spaces and mixed income neighborhoods. If these are their goals, why do they have a history of lacking transparency and inclusion of local businesses? Why have they not sat down and talked to people like Larry Ashford to figure out what has made them successful and what has made them able to serve the community for so long? The first step, though, if this dialogue is going to be formed and those goals are honestly going to be met, is lifting the cloak of judgment of what existed in Over the Rhine before development during the Dark Ages. As sociologist Saskia Sassen said, cities are the spaces where those without power get to make a history and a culture, thereby making their powerlessness complex. She theorized that the cultural imprints made by the powerless will not be possible in a business park or a different corporatized space, as those are areas where low-wage workers can work, but they are unable to create, to make a culture. It's time we listen to the history of Smitty's and other dark age businesses like it. If business models like Smitty's, which have been community serving for almost 100 years, are ignored, the chance to model development after them in a truly inclusive manner will be lost, not only to the detriment of local residents, but also to the risk of losing the unique fabric of the city. Thank you.
I'll thank you guys all too again. I know I'm the last one, so there's a little pressure having to follow all of these guys, but I just wanted to say it's been a great year working with them and with everyone else in the Humanities Center and all the faculty, scholars who are also involved in this program. So today I'm going to be talking about Costa Rican women's activism. Costa Rica is often overlooked in the larger historical narrative of 20th century Latin American history. It's often referred to as the Switzerland of Latin America and is seen as an ideal tourist destination because of its safety and its relatively nonviolent past. While this is certainly a positive reputation for a country to have, it simplifies the rich and complex history of Costa Rica. I argue that Costa Rican history is an integral part of the bigger picture of Latin America in the first half of the 20th century, both because of its adherence to larger Latin American trends and because of its uniqueness. One example of this is the emergence of influential Costa Rican urban women activists in the first half of the 20th century. These women were products of the nation's capital and urban center, San Jose, which you can see in the middle of the map. It's really the only large urban center in Costa Rica. And both larger Latin American trends and smaller local conditions allowed for urban women to challenge authority and promote their own opinions within the context of the city. The unique division of power and people in Costa Rica meant that this urban activism did not generally apply well to the rural areas of the country. Because Costa Rica was a smaller country and had been largely left to its own devices during the colonial era, its society was more open, and in the early 20th century, even parties like the Communist Party were allowed to operate freely and openly. Despite this openness, United States corporations, most infamously the United Fruit Company, controlled large portions of the rural regions of Costa Rica, making it difficult for the government to implement reforms in these regions. San Jose, however, was not the major hub for these companies. That Caribbean coast where Puerto Limones was. Thus, while the unique open urban setting of San Jose allowed for some women's voices to be heard, many other women were marginalized from that conversation. In order to understand how women were able to gain agency in the first half of the 20th century, we must first understand the concept of liberalism, an ideology that was dominant in Latin America from the late 19th century through the 20th century. In very general terms, it emphasized private property ownership, modernization, secularism, and foreign investment. Often, liberal policies marginalized poor sectors of society, particularly minority groups. In Costa Rica, liberal policies began to be implemented around 1870, and this included many reforms like privatization of land and the banning of popular customs that were deemed uncivilized and the promotion of modern hygiene. Perhaps most importantly to women, the liberal state created free, secular, and mandatory primary education for both men and women. Centralized education was seen as a tool to develop a modern civilized citizenry. The state also created normal schools, which were high schools that trained students to become teachers. As new and more lucrative jobs were developed in this newly liberal private economy, men became less attracted to the profession of teaching. In this era, women could be paid less, and their role as mothers was seen as making them natural teachers. Despite this very sexist reasoning, normal schools did give women access to a professional career, one of few professional careers that they had access to. These normal schools, however, were concentrated in the San Jose metropolitan area, meaning urban women had access to education that rural women did not. The most famous and the largest school was the Colegio Superior de las Señoritas, which was located in the heart of San Jose. Today I'll discuss one women activist, but there were many that emerged out of this school. In its first 3 decades of existence, 84% of students came from San Jose. Normal schools like the Colegio gave urban women, a space to learn and develop their own belief systems. Because students came from diverse class backgrounds, the school had a very egalitarian character. It also had a very feminist character because, again, this was one of the few professions open to women in this time. So this feminist and egalitarian character created this worldview that was cultivated within the school, and it became this very progressive community for women. The problem was this character of the school clashed with the outside world. While liberalism did give women more access to education, it greatly increased the gap between the rich and the poor. And this was very apparent in the city of San Jose. If we go back to this last slide, that's a picture of the Teatro Nacional, which was opened in 1897. It was meant to mimic cities like Paris and New York, and it was in the heart of San Jose. So women at the Colegio, which was located right next to this, would walk by this and then go home to their poor neighborhoods, which were by no means like modern or even nice. So this large gap between the rich and the poor pushed many alumni of these normal schools toward more radical ideology. One of these was Carmen Lyra. She was a teacher, a founding member of the Costa Rican Communist Party, and a talented writer. She attended the Colegio and then studied in Europe, where she developed radical ideas of education. When she returned to Costa Rica, she opened a free preschool for San Jose's poorest children, which was very radical at that time. She quickly, however, became very disillusioned by the realities of poverty. For example, she'd try to teach her students about modern hygiene and medicine, but the reality was their families just could not afford it. So she helped found the Costa Rican Communist Party in the 30s, and she began to write for the party's newspaper. She was a master of satire. Her works are hilarious. And she also wrote children's fables. Lyra was the product of free education and the normal schools, but she was also heavily influenced by the poverty that she observed around her. Her experience as a student and a teacher pushed her toward more radical ideology. The urban environment and resources of San Jose allowed Lyra to be educated and have her voice heard. Unfortunately, outside of San Jose, women did not have the same access to education or openness that Lyra did. San Jose was unique from the rest of the country because the best education was there and the imperialism of the United States was not. Resources and Costa Rican wealth were concentrated in San Jose. Outside of San Jose, especially on the Caribbean coast, American companies held much power. Women in these regions tended to be poor and uneducated, and particularly marginalized were black women, migrants largely from Jamaica that came to work in the banana plantations. Racism was a powerful force in this era, still is in Costa Rica, and black elites tended to ignore the issue of gender while women activists tended to ignore the issue of race. Thus, despite the agency that urban women gained due to increased access to education and a relatively open society, many other women did not have a voice. But the city was at the heart of the emergence of influential women in this era. When the city was taken away, women tended to have less agency. This was because education, resources, political life, and the intellectual community were all concentrated in San Jose, the only major urban center of the country. Women on the margins tended to be forgotten about. This uneven dynamic between the city and the surrounding countryside still today has led to an increased gap between the rich and the poor and to dire consequences for some women like domestic violence. Thus, this era of Costa Rica was both typical and unique in comparison to Latin American historical narratives. The country subscribed to liberal trends, and many people were marginalized from the rapidly modernizing city. But unique women activists also emerged in this era and became influential and well-known. This case in Costa Rican history shows us that the city can be a place where progressive actions and ideas thrive, or it can be a place of marginalization and exclusion, or they can operate together. Revising our understanding of the past by writing women, other marginalized groups, and forgotten past back into the historical narrative gives us a better understanding of the urban past and thus the urban future. Thank you.
Thank you for those great talks. We now have about 15 minutes for questions, comments.
I have a question for Jacob. I was wondering about, it's such a fascinating project, and the invisibility of the homeless is something we've heard so much about. And I have sort of a two-pronged question. On the one hand, I'd say, what do you make of the recent visibility of things like tent cities in Seattle and so forth, and the way in which they might be drawing attention to a situation of these other spaces, not to sound too Foucauldian, but since you brought it up, I will. And my other question is, what do you make of positive representations of the tramp, or the way that the idea of the tramp is conscripted in films by Chaplin, for example, and how that fits into the kind of larger arc of what you're discussing?
Yeah, so I'll try to keep it brief, and we can talk later too. And
Okay.
probably have a very fun conversation. To answer your first part, I think the recent visibility is something that I think is a product of on the one hand, like very innovative, but also contentious like developments in urban spaces. So like Seattle, that's going on. In Las Vegas, the city government is like actually institutionalizing the homeless camp. They're building like a roof over it pretty much, and like they're going to provide resources there. So like there's some interesting like policy going on. I think it's maybe Lewis and Clark. There's some university in Oregon that's actually like allowing the homeless encampment to stay rather than like demolishing it. And then it's like that cyclical thing where park rangers come in, destroy everything or hose everything, and then public or private property, what private property the homeless may have is destroyed, and of course they build those communities. But I mean, maybe again to return to the recent visibility, I think it's a good thing. It is drawing attention to these spaces, but I also don't want the recent visibility to obscure like the ways in which they have been visible in the past. So like one of the most fascinating phenomena about like homelessness in the United States is street publications. There are a couple in Cincinnati, and I've talked with a few people in here about them. But I mean, the recent visibility again, I think, is part of all these new publications. For example, like there are several really broad online platforms that detail like urban developments and that do a lot of reporting on this, which is great. But also, like, I do want to recognize that there's a long tradition of these like street publications that are kind of asserting their agency. I don't know if that really answers your question. And then two, to the tramp in American history, Charlie Chaplin's it's a very fascinating example, and there's a similar case with the hobo where like there's a romanticization that's going on starting in the late 19th century after the Civil War, and especially coming up through like the 30s. It's certainly a thing, and so like one of the primary sources I use for this project are newspaper columns, and so you have lots of like personal columns in newspapers across the United States. And this is just one example, talking about like Girl Scouts going tramping. So that's a different, sort of way in which it's romanticized and it's made into an adventure. And again, like that's maybe you're asking a two-pronged question. I'll respond with it by saying that's I think a prong of this condition. That's certainly a tract in which the meaning of homelessness as a condition, again broadly, has developed. And there is like the hobo, for example. Burger King ran an advertisement a year or two ago using the Rock Candy Mountain song, which was a huge part of hobo culture in America. And of course that was like initially a song produced that was about the plight of like, wandering around the United States. There's some sexual, relationships going on in that song too. But Burger King, of course, co-opted that, I think in 2006, and of course made it into something about like the Whopper. And so like there are all these trends going on where like these identities, these labels are sort of made into a romantic thing, and of course that doesn't always persist, and it varies city by city. But maybe that answers the question.
Okay, Abby,
Yes.
can you talk a little bit about the goal of eco poetics? I mean, this seems like it's an artistic response to the horror of environmental change. Is there an activism aspect to this too, or is it more sort of therapeutic for the poet and the readers of the poems?
I think in the literature itself, there's been not loads written on the very specific stuff. There's multiple people trying to work out like what this theory could be. And so one of the authors I cite, Pierre Jonge, he talks about it as not only a way to write poetry, but a way to read poetry which has already been written. And personally, my argument is that it can be in some ways therapeutic, but it itself can be a point of resistance to the dominant ideology. whether it's your individual reading of a poem or your creation of new poetry, by engaging in this type of, you might call it more slow or potentially more contemplative relationship with other being, you're able to kind of resist the mindset that commercializes and commodifies those things. So hope that answers maybe.
I have a question for Sam. When you talked about briefly at the end about like dating and or hookup apps, and I'm wondering if you think that has the potential to perhaps spread some of this, the characteristic of urban cities, which you described as like the dense population and the like turnover of different spaces and plurality of spaces. I'm wondering if you think those apps as sort of like virtual spaces has that potential in rural communities, or to change that heteronormativity or whatever.
Yeah, and I'd say that especially in rural communities, the internet has absolutely been a game changer, because the internet allows for contact without having to physically put yourself in a space. So it allows for people to sort of navigate the closet more easily, and it allows for that kind of contact. But sort of what you see in a lot of this old literature about gay bars or about these porn theaters was that it was more than just a hookup, and it was more than just even a relationship. It was about building a community. And it was about building a community that allowed for a healthy sexuality to exist, but that also offered other social and material benefits. And that is absolutely what we have lost now. There's none of that. And we're continuing to lose that every time a gay bar closes down, or every time a new mayoral administration in any city decides to clean things up. You know, this sort of goes to what Phoebe was talking about. When you're cleaning things up, you have to shove something in the trash. And a lot of times what's being shoved in the trash is marginalized communities who have been that trash and have made that trash their home. And maybe it's damn good trash. And instead of throwing it away, we should be looking at why was that trash able to be there for so long? And how was that trash able to survive? Because it's really not trash. It's what people's lives and people's communities. And so in that sense, I think the internet has allowed for far-flung trash to connect. But I think that that connection is a very different type of connection. And it's a connection that ultimately I think is less productive for political action, is less productive for community building, and is less productive for society as a whole.
I had a question for Phoebe. Is it right?
Phoebe,
sorry, Phoebe.
You're good.
So something that struck me about when listening to your paper about the gentrification of Over the Rhine is that it seems to be that nothing ever changes about gentrification, right? Like even back to Haussmann in the 19th century in Paris. Is that the perception you got, or do you take a broader historical perspective where you see, is there anything unique about the gentrification of Cincinnati or of Over the Rhine? And then also I was interested in like what do you think is going to happen to Smitty's? Like is it going to survive? Do they think they're going to survive? What do they think about what's going on?
Excellent questions. I've also been thinking about these things. So I feel like a common argument that like tries to portray gentrification as natural is the idea that like, oh, neighborhoods always change. In some degree, I think like through like a variety of events that can be true. What I think may be more unique to what is happening in Over the Rhine, or even just what is happening more like currently in other examples also around the world, is it's not just the people who are moving into these areas, it's kind of also the renewed interest in creating private investment. I feel like almost in the case of Over the Rhine, I feel the situation was kind of reversed in a way. Oftentimes gentrification works with like people moving in first, and then later comes investment and privatization, those sort of things. I feel like in a lot of ways, maybe Cincinnati felt pressured to make changes quickly after the riots, and so went really into trying to get investments, trying to create these privatized businesses. So even before, I think, new different kinds of people were moving into the neighborhood, the cityscape had already been changing. And I think that Kathleen Norris quote kind of speaks to that, like trying very, very hard to get investors specifically to enter. So I feel like that might be one thing that's making it more unique and probably more, even more sinister than previous aspects of gentrification. It's just the prevalence of all of this private investment and the reduction of public spaces. And then what I think is going to happen to Smitty's, it's a very good question. I feel like it has a few things going for it to be able to continue to survive, namely being that it has already been there for so long, and also that it is white owned in incredibly, the demographics are still mainly African American in over the Rhine. So for better or worse, I feel like that is something that will probably be able to preserve it for a little bit longer. But it is a very good question. Like Larry Ashford is getting older. He's, I think, like 70 now, around that age, and it's not exactly clear who might kind of take his position afterwards, and if like the community value of Larry and that store will continue to be the same. So I feel like hopefully if the community connections and if that space is still able to function as a third space, like outside of work and home for residents, that it will continue to survive. But if those residents are all relocated, then the community will probably not be able to protect it.
Question just wanted to connect to what some of your talks to the really excellent keynote we had last night. It seems like a common underlying theme in a number of your papers is again kind of neoliberal governance and sort of the shrinking of the public sphere, the privatization of various things, as well as this kind of intercity competition, which we heard kind of articulated really well yesterday. And so I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on just sort of the idea of the public and what constitutes the public interest, the public sector, the public sphere. We live in a moment in which ideas of the public are really denigrated, they're in decline, they're out of sorts, whatever. And I'm just wondering, just as an open question, I'm very interested, just because you're coming at this at a different generational age than I am, like, do you see the possibility of a rehabilitation of a sense of the public? And is that a useful concept to begin rethinking and intervening in ways that urban governance is pretty anti-public?
Well, you spoke to the generational difference,
Sure.
and I think that in many ways
Not that much over.
well, I think our generation has benefited from the work that's been done by the generations before us, and a lot of
Roll credits.
So much groundbreaking work has been done that we're now able to consume to teach us empathy and to teach us understanding for groups other than those that we're members of, that we've been able to inherit, and hopefully we can then take that tradition and make it into a new public. As for when we'll be able to do that, we'll see. There's an election in November. You know? It's gonna be up to. I think the younger generation is capable of making a new public, but it's going to depend on when the older generation gets with the picture.
I think maybe another aspect of this is I've noticed kind of a reduction in faith in government, even at the local level. And I think that in the case of Cincinnati and how 3CDC operates as a public-private entity, they are not responsible to voters. So in a certain sense, even though they operate as a nonprofit, they ultimately answer to a board of directors, which are representatives of like Procter & Gamble, Kroger, Macy's, well, like have corporate interests. And so I guess what I would like to see happen is to kind of renew that faith in government and to like see that, oh, you know, if the Cincinnati as like a political sphere starts taking more of an active role in how development is going to operate, like voters can hold them more accountable and like potentially have a city that more represents their interests. But I feel like we're going to need to see some changes to kind of get that faith in government back, especially among younger people, so that things don't continually be carried out by private entities with corporate interests. I think that that is like a really key thing to regain that trust in government.
And I think a bit going off that, something that we've all discussed a bit is the ways in which the public is being fragmented, whether it's spatially or socially, with the development of larger the ability to like buy things online, to we were discussing at dinner yesterday the ability to just like go to Starbucks and like not talk to anyone. And so I think one of a necessary prerequisite to this, something that I think aligns with what I was talking about in my paper, is a very active attempts to kind of push back against some of this fragmentation of the public and to reach out to not just other people but to the spaces that you're involved in. And by kind of going back to this maybe literal like foundational surface, that we can then begin to kind of start redeveloping or strengthening our publics.
Do we have time? Cool. I'm pessimistic about the question. Can the public, or can our publics be rehabilitated? I think that if they can be rehabilitated, it will require the efforts of three cohorts: academics, activists, maybe think of activists maybe as organic intellectuals, and bureaucrats. And I'm sorry to admit, maybe bureaucrats might upset some people, but there are two types of publics I think we could talk about. There are physical publics, which we could maybe consider our urban spaces or our rural spaces, the public square, and then you have digital publics. Both of those things I'm worried about. One, because you have like a rapid commercialization of both of those things that is like obvious. I mean, we don't have time to talk about this really, but that's kind of inherently a problematic thing for anything that's public, right? But at the same time, you have like these broader like social trends in digital publics and physical publics both of we've heard a lot about this in the past couple of years: echo chambers, vitrolic conversations. So our digital publics have become polar. I mean, there are exceptions in some Reddit subfeeds. There's some civil conversation that goes on there, right? And in some Facebook feeds, but by and large, digital conversation, our digital publics have become polarized. There's a lot of data and like research on digital publics not really being able to affect change in the same way like older types of activism was able to affect change. And of course, that's on the decline. Like one of the things that we talked about at dinner last night was something that someone who really I think has a lot to say about the public and urban futures, but who probably would not be brought up in typical conversation, is Robert Putnam, right? A social scientist who traces the death of civil society over the past 30 years. And so like when you look at homelessness, while homelessness is definitely like being brought on in the 80s and the 70s, 80s, and 90s by the neoliberal city, it's also being brought on by in a Brennerian kind of way, like the rural. Also, you're seeing like the death of social institutions like churches, like other voluntary associations that are structured in ways that can like meet that made the publics outside of the urban publics like more valuable. And of course, that's like kind of a weird distinction because are those urban publics or are they rural publics? That's like again like a Neil Brenner kind of thing. But I think it's up to academics to sort of push back against some of the perversions going on in our publics, activists to fight back on the ground. And then I think that although there's a death of public faith in the state, I mean the state will have to intervene in some cases. Like last night's keynote, for example, really demonstrates that there are market forces at work that are corrupting the public in ways that activists are going to be really challenged, to push back on their own. Like there will have to be, to some extent, state. That's my opinion. There will have to be state intervention too. So, long-winded answer.
This is just a little flippant, but the people of Cincinnati are speaking, right? They're declaring their independence. One of you, maybe it was Phoebe, mentioned the Senate restaurant, $10 hot dogs. There's a line outside the Senate every single day, an hour before they open. I mean, people, there's this thirst for this revitalized part of Over the Rhine along Vine Street by many, many people that vote in the city of Cincinnati. I don't know what my point is. It is flippant, but it's at odds with perhaps the survival of a business like the one that you studied.
I feel like some of what I would like to find out more about is if those customers are largely based in Over the Rhine, or if they're traveling from other parts of Cincinnati, or even from other cities in order to almost act as a tourist in their own location. It was actually very interesting to talk to Larry because he did not have altogether negative views of the development. But I was there around lunchtime, and so I was like, where should I go to eat? Have you tried any of the restaurants down this way? And he said, no, I can't afford to eat there. And that was kind of the opinion of the other employees who were there at the time also. So I feel like maybe looking at it as a whole citywide, or even like the county who might be interested in these restaurants, still there's some lack of communication between those people who might be living there and people who are right down the street from where these are opening. So I feel like some kind of dialogue between those two groups might be very helpful.
So we have time for one more quick comment.
Okay.
And Miguel had his hand up earlier. Do you want to give us?
Yeah, if it's okay. I mean,
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, I mean, because we have very short time and we're almost there. I just want to make some comments in terms of recommendations for further research. So put them to the professor hat rather than asking you stuff. And I'm not sure if I will be able to cover all of you, right? But I specifically felt a need to recommend or to respond, or perhaps even to add to Sam, about your paper. I've been very much involved in the issue of queer communities in New York City, especially since I have a lot of students from that space that they really work around. And one of the things that New York did to me is I learned a lot from that space. And one of the things that I didn't find very clear in your paper, and this is something you definitely have to do, is that you seem to mix, or at least the way you presented it, homosexuality with queerness. And your title is in relation to queer, and a lot of the subjects that you discuss are homosexual subjects, right? And I think it's incredibly important that you basically make this distinction, because in many of your studies, homosexuality is seen as almost like totally taking over heteronormative, rules and so forth, right? And queerness is something that goes beyond the state of mind. It doesn't necessarily needs to gender precisely, as many issues. And I find that there's more potential in your arguments and whatever you're trying to say if you focus much more on queer sort of text, queer culture, queer everything, rather than figuring out that mixity between homosexuality and queerness. So that's something that stood out, right? And Jacob, I think, if I summarize what you did, is you were trying to trace a story of the imaginaries around homeless people. And you put a lot of emphasis on, actually, I would say it's not even necessary, of all these terminologies that people refer to. I mean, it's like, I'd say half of your talk was about, the way that people refer to homelessness. I think if you want to do that, if you want to trace a story of the representations of homeless people, it's fine the way that you're moving, but if you really want to understand the condition of homelessness, the issue, you really need to go into political economy. I mean, there is very little touch in your talk about why is it that we have homeless people, right? Homeless people is a consequence of a lot of politics, a lot of economic decisions. Yes, in some cases about mental illness, in some cases about other, substance abuse and so forth. But the majority of the times, and this is something you have to put very clear, homeless people don't fit into that space. If you go to a homeless shelter in New York City, the majority of the people are actually have college degrees, right? Any of us here, we miss a paycheck, we might actually be homeless because the majority of Americans don't have any savings, right? So I think it's categorical that you basically, instead of using language to continue that they use to marginalize things, you have to start by changing in your topic the idea that we all have about homelessness, right? And by that also discussing about what are the causes of homelessness so that you can later begin to trace why is it that homelessness is referred to in such derogatory terms, continuously, right? How the market has been used and how the market has exploded. I work a lot on the homeless issues. I mean, we have a huge activist in New York working on these issues. And it's very clear that it's a business. It's a fantastic business. I mean, homelessness exists the way that it exists because it's just billions of dollars are poured into the industry, right? A lot of people make a lot of money of this. So it really is that space. So you don't touch that. So I think you need to be more clear on what is the specific thing that you're looking at the history of, right? It was for me not so clear. I'm taking a lot. Okay, later I talk to all of you, okay?
Yeah, I think we should, and I just want to say, I know there could be lengthy responses to that. They were limited to 10 minutes or their life was in peril. So I know they have stuff to say, but we need to get back on schedule, so let's thank our panel and grab some coffee.